no matter who conquered China, it could be Turkic, Mongol, Manchu, whoever that conquered China, the fact that they use that language, they all become Han. I think you'll have to say that both democracy and autocracy are different ways of trying to build a better society for the people to have a more stable, harmonious, and successful and prosperous lives. The fact that he became Secretary General of the party was not his ambition. He didn't plan to be that.
Right.
When his name was proposed, lots of people had never heard of him. And why was he chosen? He was chosen because he had no faction, and in the calculations of the strategists in America, they came to the conclusion that there were none except possibly, potentially, China. The only possible threat to Americans' number one sole superpower position was China.
大家好，今天要分享的是今年8月，著名的历史学家王庚武教授接受印尼前商务部长吉塔维贾万采访的节选。在这一段访谈中，王庚武教授纵横捭阖，从公元前3世纪秦汉大一统，一路梳理至21世纪中美战略竞争，用精炼的语言贯通性阐述了中国文明内核的演变与国家形态的进化，充分展现出他作为一名历史学家抽丝剥茧、多维思辨的专业素养与知识魅力。王庚武祖籍江苏泰州，因为他父亲在印尼当地华人学校从事教育工作，他1930年出生在印尼，后来随父母搬迁到马来西亚，是著名的海外华人历史学家，曾在马来亚大学、澳大利亚国立大学、新加坡国立大学等多所学校任职。1986年到1995年担任香港大学校长。他还是北京大学、清华大学、复旦大学等多所高校的名誉教授，是中国社会科学院的名誉研究员。王庚武教授对中国历史文化有着深厚的研究和理解。他认为华夏文明的原始内核体现为道统或天下观念，本身不具有边界意识。他关注中国的发展，认为中国正经历第4次崛起。他以海外华人学者的双重视角，解构中国从古老文明向现代民族国家的转型历程，思考当今中国面临的持久挑战，强调中国的国家认同既建立在共同的政治框架之上，又包容着丰富的文化差异，形成了多元一体的复杂格局。我们来看看他是怎么说的。
Professor, you did your thesis on the power structure in the 5 dynasties of China. I want to start talking about China. Tell us your views about how civilizations have changed in China during those 5 dynasties by way of the power structure, but some of the cultural elements that have remained or stayed consistently all throughout.
I think I can best talk about China by comparing ancient China to what we call India today, ancient India. Because by contrasting the two, we can understand China better. Because India was a powerful civilization with brilliant ideas, which were recorded in what we have now in the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and all those Rig Vedas, texts and so on, which we still preserved in Sanskrit. A very ancient set of ideas that emerged out of a group of people, various groups of people who didn't do it together. They didn't do it, as it were, as a state. They had different philosophers and thinkers whose imagination led them to devise different ways of looking at the world. And they did it essentially in the Ganges Valley, but some in the south, some in the north. But China developed in a completely different way. They also developed on the river system, the Yellow River. But from the very beginning, they found that they had tremendous challenges in a river that constantly flooded. And they had to find a way of surviving when the rivers flooded. And they did it by organizing themselves in very structured ways of dealing with the floods. And then they created, in a way, a bureaucracy to deal with a common problem. When I look at the history of the Ganges or the Indus, they never flooded in the same way that the Yellow River flooded. There were plains. Whenever it flooded, it really destroyed millions of lives caught in that flood. This is not true in India. So the Indians never faced that problem. They could deal with each problem separately. The Chinese couldn't. They had to find one solution to this, and they created a civilization of highly skilled and trained engineers, in a way, hydraulic engineers, to deal with water. And that became the basis of an administrative structure, which we would now call a bureaucracy, of officials who were selected because of their skills in dealing with a water flooding situation. And over time, they grew into a large organization because the river was such a long river, and you got to deal with the whole length of it, and it was constantly flooding, and they didn't know how to do it. Otherwise, they created a system which depended on a unitary state, one powerful one after the other. And eventually that one was brought together in the 3rd century BC into an empire, the Qin Han Empire. The Qin Empire brought together a number of states, all very similar, but all producing the kind of skills which control a state bureaucracy to deal with their flooding problems in their particular area. The details are too complicated, but the essential message is that out of very different systems, they produce different civilizations. The Indian one was always open to different ideas. The wise people wandered around sharing their ideas, referring to different gods, drawing upon the gods, as it were, to explain their life on earth. The Chinese didn't quite do that. They didn't seem to need that kind of spiritual help from gods. Instead, they developed a kind of a Tian idea. There's a kind of superior natural order, a power they call heaven, we translate as heaven, which you draw upon, which is nothing to do with God, and it has got a will of its own, but they provide the framework in which you could develop your human values and develop them in such a way that they will provide for everybody by wise leaders who are all thinking of how to better the societies that they are responsible for, and then they select among themselves, educate and train them to do this in an orderly way. So the sense of unitary order and the sense of continuity, the sense that every dynasty or every king or every administration has lessons to teach the next administration was valid. So you develop a sense of history that everybody learns from the past. So the Chinese actually developed that and used their writing to transmit the lessons from one generation to another. And that sense of history became one history, continuous, basically continuous for now 3,000 years. India had nothing like that. The opposite. India does not believe in history. There are words of wisdom which come from the great classics of literature and religious and spiritual life, and they've inherited that and interpret that in different ways in the names of different gods. Your Vishnu, your Krishna, your Shiva provides different inspirations for how you interpret it. It was not one single religion in a way, it was a body of different religious responses to the demands of life, which created a great civilization. To me, that is, could go back to this peculiarity of the Chinese state, was that its language was not alphabetic. I know this has been much speculated on, but I think it is a crucial differentiation of the Chinese state, was that because it was not alphabetic, it was possible to unite multiple cultures who spoke different languages, didn't understand each other, because they could read the same text in ideographic text and not have to depend on how you pronounce it. Didn't matter how you pronounce it. When you read it, it's the same meaning, same word. Everybody understood the language you use. That made it possible for this civilization to bring together probably dozens of different cultures to be part of one civilization based on the fact that they all now use this ideographic language which everybody could understand. All you have to do is to learn to read it. Of course, literacy rate was not high, but if you understood, your leadership all read the same books, didn't speak the language, but you could write to each other. And in the same way, they could deal with Japan and Korea and Vietnam, didn't understand the language at all, but they used the same script. So that was not happening elsewhere. When it was alphabetical, then what you do is you try to write in the way you speak. And by so doing, you formalize and in fact freeze the language into the written word and then create different languages, then drawing borders between the languages and creating the 20 odd different states in Europe, for example. They created the nation-state idea. Because one of the key to the nation-state idea was that it was based on one language. That is, to the Chinese mind, it was incredible. Because you base on that, China would have been 25 different states today. Because there are 25 different or more different languages in China. But the unity of the script enabled the aristocracy or meritocracy to actually ensure that all of them share the same values because you read the same text. That's why China is a peculiar and unique civilization because of that. But today you're facing a different problem. The problem is today is that language has become the national language of one country. Because the Vietnamese no longer use it, the Koreans don't use it anymore. The Japanese use some of it, but they've created other katakana, hiragana ways of getting out of it. But only the Chinese now use that language. So it has, in a way, created borders for itself. Now their problem is to make sure that everybody within those borders use the same language, which creates a different set of problems for themselves. So you can see how the modern China, by inheriting that past, has actually forced them to face a different kind of challenge, which other countries don't have. It's, in that sense, very interesting.
It took a long time for the Han ethnicity to be consolidated.
Well, it was consolidated eventually, if I may come back to the point, when they all learned the same written language. Because the moment you accept that same language, you inherit the whole body of literature that is written in that language. It becomes part of your heritage. And if you share that heritage, you become Han. It doesn't matter about your ethnicity. It's what you share in that language and the body of ideas and literate texts that come with the language. Once you share that, that's what makes you Han. And what makes today, what is the Chinese of the PRC, that's what they share. And that is also, you might say, consolidated by that sense of history. Because from the beginning, you started to record it in the same way, in that same language, one language. No matter who conquered China, it could be Turkic, Mongol, Manchu, whoever that conquered China, the fact that they use that language, they all become Han. Because that language determined their identity.
Professor, you've talked about this earlier, but I want to hear again. The transition from the Manchu or Qing dynasty to a nationalist China, thereafter to a communist China. how's your view about this? 3 episodes that I thought
itself is part and parcel of this oneness of China. You see, when you are united in that way as a unit, as no matter who rules, at that time it was ruled by Manchus, but the Manchus by that time all had learned Chinese,
right?
And they, without even thinking about it, they have become Han, because that's their common language.
Yeah.
They no longer use Manchu except among themselves. Nobody else learned Manchu, but every Manchu learned the Han Chinese language in order to deal with the Chinese, who are the majority.
Yeah.
So they had become Han. So how do you distinguish by that time? But the fact was that it was European, you might say, introduction of the idea of national empires that made the Chinese conscious of the fact that these Manchus are not us. They are not Han. They are invaders from outside who conquered us. And in the name of their national empire, to restore our nationality, we must drive them out. So this is how Sun Yat-sen started. And most of the southern Chinese, particularly south of the Yangtze, were most anti-Manchu because they were treated the worst by the Manchus. The Manchus had a lot of trouble. They were fighting the Manchus longer, and the Manchus treated them badly. Whereas in the north, they were so close to the Manchus, they operated quite closely, and they were not so hostile to the Manchus. But the southerners were. So Sun Yat-sen and all these leaders of that rebellion against the Manchus were in the name of the Chinese nation as opposed to the Manchu nation. Even though, in fact, they all knew that the Manchus were all using Han and using Chinese when they're dealing, especially when they're ruling China. So in that context, Sun Yat-sen's only way of dealing with it was to take up the European idea of nationhood and use the nation state as his base for fighting the Manchus. And it had to be in the name of the Han nation against the Manchus. That's how it started. But at the same time, because the dynasty was a Manchu dynasty, and they wanted to get rid of the Manchus, the idea developed that, do we need an emperor? So Sun Yat-sen's more radical supporters said, we don't need an emperor. I mean, the Japanese have an emperor, the British have an emperor, but the French don't have an empire. You don't need an emperor. The Americans don't have an emperor. You don't need an emperor. A republic is good enough. So gradually they came down to the idea that when we get rid of the Manchus, we get rid of the idea of an emperor at the same time. But if you do that, you're actually breaking with the continuity of Chinese history. Because all that continuity was based on dynastic leadership of emperors, one after the other. Now you say you get rid of the emperor, you start with the republic. How do you begin? When the vast majority of the Chinese people never heard of the word republic, didn't know what it meant. So he had to sell the idea, and he found it very, very difficult. And one of the famous things that Sun Yat-sen said was, the Chinese have no sense of nation. They were never a nation. They were subjects of an emperor. So under the Ming, the subject of the Ming. Under the Qing, subjects of the Qing. Whether they were Han Chinese or Manchus were less important than the fact that they were subjects of the emperor. Now you're telling them there's no emperor. There's a president. Who is a president? A republic. What's a republic? So as you can see, that first revolution in 1912 ended up very badly. Nobody knew what to do with a republic. So all these military people started to fight each other in the warlords, trying to be president. And some of them wanted to be emperors, but they were uncertain what they wanted. Essentially, then the westernized Chinese, they said, the only way to save China is not to save the China as a nation. That is not enough. You've got to save Chinese civilization. Because it is tied to the civilization, if you want to be Chinese. It's not nationhood is not meaningful to the Chinese. But what they shared was a civilization. So if that civilization dies, Where's the Chinese? Who's the Chinese? So in a funny sort of way, they were tremendously impressed by what we call social Darwinism. By interpreting Darwin among human beings. Darwin was talking about evolution of species, but you translate it to human beings, you say that the survival of the fittest meant that if you're not fit to survive, you're finished, you're gone. So social Darwinism began to be interpreted mean that the greatest powers deserve to survive, and if you lose, you deserve to die. Your civilization will die. So then they saw themselves as Chinese civilization defeated by Western civilization. How do you save that? So then the idea was we have to learn from the West. Taking the Republic is only just a beginning. We have to learn everything from the West. So in the May 4th movement, some of the brightest intellectuals of the time said that China could only be saved by adopting two things, science and democracy. This is Chen Tuxiu. He identified that, and the whole generation of the 1910s and 20s adopted that as their slogan. Science and democracy was the only way to save China, both of which are learned from the West. Neither science nor democracy had existed in China before, not in that form anyway. So they were prepared to go all the way, be westernized. But then, as it turned out, this is where the communists come in. The communists identified, because of the ideas from the Soviet Union, the success of the Russian Revolution meant that the Chinese said, there's no one way of westernization. That is also westernization. So you might say there's westernization 1 and westernization 2. Why do you choose westernization 1? He said, does it suit us? And Mao Zedong said, we're 90% peasantry. Capitalism doesn't suit us. And to have the capitalists rule over us is against everything that is Chinese. We've never had a Chinese dynasty or world ruled by businessmen. We've always been meritocracy of people who are selected for their skills and so on and their wisdom. Whereas the Soviet Revolution identified idealists, political imaginary people who imagined a better world called socialism or communism, internationalism, whatever it was, you call it, not at the expense of the poor, but to lift up the poor against those capitalists who are exploiting the poor. So if you put it in very simple terms, Mao Zedong could tell the peasantry to say, we don't want that West, which would be dominated by capitalists and businessmen. And in the Chinese context, the businessmen were the lowest of the social strata. Cannot be trusted because they only make money for themselves, never for the country. This is how it's interpreted. Selfish, money-making, money-grabbing, this is the prejudice is built into the Chinese system for thousands of years. So now these are people, idealists, who want a better world in which the poor will be taken care of and the rich will be put in their place, so to speak. This is westernization too. It's westernization too. And they said, we choose westernization too. And then they started a civil war, which is not so much between Chinese as between Western 1 and Western 2. And Western 2, to everybody's surprise, won. Now, how it won, there's a long story, but that actually tells, in a way, the story of the Chinese civilization. In the end, Mao Zedong was able to say, if you have 90% peasantry, if I rouse the peasantry to take Western 2 will have a chance to win. And you, as capitalists, cannot win over the peasantry because you only have the support of the landlords. You lose. You only represent less than 10% of the country. So the numbers win. We have more than you. And they won. So in that sense, they've reinterpreted the whole of Chinese history using the Marxist categories to talk about capitalism, socialism as a kind of stage in history. But in effect, they didn't quite know how to do it, and Mao Zedong made a mess of it. It took a long time to sort it out. They needed a second revolution to work it out.
I want to pick up on that. Talk about his notion of this need of continuous or perennial revolutions. Please elaborate.
Well, that is actually, Mao took up a phrase which exists in Leninism somewhere. Stalinism all had that word, continuous revolution, but they never really believed in it. Mao Zedong had some crazy idea that he could actually make that into a dynamic force for change in China by continuous revolution. Never give up the idea of revolution. Always be prepared to change to be better. In fact, of course, it never had a chance to work. Life is not like that. In the end, people want stability and want certainty. You have a revolution because it was necessary. You have no other solution. You have a revolution. But after the revolution, you want to get back to normalcy, stability, and so harmony and all the other things. But he didn't believe in that. He believed that if you don't have continuous revolution, all these the new elites will become elites. The new leaders of the Communist Party will become like the Mandarins, and like in a way like the capitalists. They've been corrupted by power and wealth, and they like to have their families stay on top, and the poor will always remain poor. So Mao Zedong sold the idea that the only way to prevent that from happening is to have continuous revolution, constantly making sure that nobody will develop an elite system on top. He may have something to it, that there's some truth in that, but the thing is that you cannot build a society or a country, a successful country or successful economy based on continuous challenging, fighting each other all the time.
Yeah.
So the whole thing collapsed because economically it just couldn't survive. It was total failure. And you needed somebody like Deng Xiaoping to come. But what did Deng Xiaoping represent? What he said was very simple. We've had our revolution.
Yeah.
We need reform. And what reform meant was not to reform little things. The reform is to consolidate the revolution, to make sure that the revolution that we had now works, actually succeeds in producing the stable, prosperous society that makes socialism attractive. This is Deng Xiaoping's formula. So he replaced revolution with the word reform, and particularly emphasized economic reforms because he recognized another thing which was very interesting. He took the Marxist thing seriously to say that you can only have socialism after you've had capitalism.
Yeah.
And since China never had capitalism, you had to go back to capitalism because capitalism knows how to make money. And socialism does not. Socialism's idea is that when you have the money, you distribute it fairly so that nobody is too rich and nobody is too poor. You make the distribution more fair. And that's what socialism is good for. But if you have no money, no wealth to begin with, what do you distribute? What's the point of distributing poverty?
Yeah.
So you have to distribute wealth. And to do that, you have to create the wealth. And the only way to create the wealth is to make use of the capitalist system. So he essentially opened the door to capitalist enterprise, but under the Communist Party. The Communist Party is there, but they know that you have to go through a capitalist stage before you can really have socialism. That is Deng Xiaoping's genius. And he used reform to make the revolution is to create the conditions to enable this to happen, but we need reform to make sure that each step of the way we are adopting the correct methods of creating wealth that makes socialism attractive, so that socialism can occur, can happen. You can't have socialism without prosperity.
Food on the table. Professor, since 1978, it's striking and kind of an ostensible observation that China, whatever it calls itself, an autocracy, socialism, non-democracy, it's been dogged in democratizing talents. Paradoxically, many democracies around the world have not done a good job in democratizing talent. I mean, China has been a lot more visible in selecting talent more based on meritocracy as opposed to loyalty and or patronage. What's your view on this? The juxtaposition between an autocracy like China that's been able to better democratize talents versus democracies around the world that have not been doing as good a job in democratizing talent.
If you're neutral in using these political terms and not taking sides, I think you'll have to say that both democracy and autocracy are different ways of trying to build a better society for the people to have a more stable, harmonious, and successful and prosperous lives. Both of them have the same goal. One is using democratic methods, the other is autocratic method. Less control, more freedom, less freedom. But they're both meant to build a better society. So if you start with that, no biases, start with that,
sure.
Then I think the major difference, in my view, is that how do you make sure of the succession system in the system to make sure that the succession produces the same results one generation after another, continue to do that. And what happened is that in the whole of history, political systems have had to face this problem of succession. And in ancient times, the tribal leaders usually pass it on to his son. That's one alternative. The other alternative is to pass it on to the next brave, strongest man in the tribe. Then he has to prove that he's the strongest man by having to kill all the others less strong. So you have a succession problem which is violent. The strongest man wins, or the most popular man wins, or pass it on to your son, no arguments. My elder son is my heir apparent, his son will be his apparent, and then you create a dynastic system. You look around the whole of world history, for 90% of world history, systems of succession have been based on dynastic succession, father to the son, because it avoids a lot of problems. You don't have to argue. I'm the king, the next king is my son. So you know you don't have the problem. So you solve the problem of succession. So if I'm autocratic, I can remain autocratic, but I have to show, demonstrate that I care for the people and I can provide the people with good governance. Because otherwise, you won't accept my son. If I'm a bad ruler, you won't even accept my son. If I'm a good ruler, you accept my son and go on and my grandson and so on. Until one of them is a bad ruler, then you throw him out. Then the people have the right to rebel. This is Manchu's, right? He said it long ago. People have the right to rebel against bad emperors. And when they rebel, and they produce a new emperor with a new mandate, the mandate of heaven, a new mandate. So that is already sort of built into the system. But the system is dynastic until somebody is a bad emperor, then you chuck it and you replace the dynasty. The democratic system is another way of saying, we don't want this dynastic system. This idea of father, son, aristocratic and so on is bad. So ever since the Enlightenment with the nation state, with citizenry, we are all citizens, we all can qualify to be the ruler. But how do we make sure that the right person is your successor? The British solution turned out to be the safest. Nobody dies. Everybody is, you vote, everybody has a vote, the citizen has a vote, and whoever wins, wins and rules for such a time until the next vote. So it was really quite a clever system that the British actually involved. It actually, nobody else had it. It was actually Britain that first had it. The French and the Germans all came much later. The Germans very reluctantly. But They came much later. The Scandinavians had it. But most people didn't really understand that. Because how do you select from these millions of people who say, I want to be president, So in the end, there was always a temptation to move to a dynastic system. But then the citoyen had rejected it.
Right.
So this is what we are faced with today. What we call democracy and autocracy is democracy provides a safe and peaceful way of ensuring a succession. The other way, very uncertain, bitter fights, and the Communist Party has not solved it. So when we talk about autocracy today, autocratic systems all have this problem unless they're dynastic. The only dynastic thing going on today is in North Korea. A communist system using the dynastic system is really a comedy. It's a paradox. And these are the people who talk about socialism and equality and so on, and their system is dynastic because they did not know how to do it. They looked at the Soviet Union, it became a mess. They looked at Mao Zedong, how dangerous it was, and Deng Xiaoping tried to fix it by choosing his successors, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, but he couldn't choose any more because they're too young. So when it came to Hu Jintao, who to succeed Hu Jintao? They didn't know how to do it. They picked Xi Jinping, but who knows? And Xi Jinping, how is he going to pick his own successor? So there's fundamentally a kind of instability built into that system, which caused the Soviet Union to collapse, the Soviet Communist Party to collapse. And Xi Jinping is very conscious of that. When he came in, the first thing he said to his Communist Party was, look at the Soviet Communist Party. We are modeled on that, and look at how they ended. It could happen to us too, because corruption, internal fighting, factionism, and so on, we could easily end up like the Soviet Union. So he wanted to stop that by having more control. So the autocratic thing part became even more autocratic to try and guarantee a more stable succession, but he still can't find the answer even today. But the democracy, the other way, the other problem of democracy is that after a while, it doesn't matter whether you know anything or not. If you're popular, you could be president. So it ends up with what you call populism. And populism means that you're just satisfying the people, giving them what they want and so on, but there's no principle behind it all. And that populism, according to their own theoreticians in Aristotelian politics, populism ends up with dictatorships. So either way has problems, but they all arise because both systems face this problem of succession. How do you make your succession always successful? Neither side knows how to do it. Democracy had done very, very well until now, and now we're a little bit uncertain.
How do you explain to a lay person like me, or to the lay people out there, in the context of differentiating Xi Jinping from Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong?
I think the big difference is very obvious. Mao Zedong was the father of a revolution. He really went through a tremendous period of challenges and difficulties, and he was creative. In his own way, he was a political genius to make use of the conditions to build the successful PLA that won the war, the Civil War, and was a war won on the battlefield, not won by any democratic means, battlefield. But in his mind, they won because the people were with them. So it is democracy in that sense. The people supported them. That is how he would believe it. But that was done by a man who spent 40 years of his life fighting against his comrades as well as against the enemy to reach that position of sole control over a party and an army that won on the battlefield in a traditional way, defeating the enemy on the ground. Who else could have done that? So Mao Zedong is unique in that way. Like him or not, and he was a disaster in the end, but nobody can deny him that victory in 1949. That was what he did. So he deserves a particular kind of position as the man who succeeded, won the victory, won the mandate of heaven, you might say. Now, Deng Xiaoping was actually his partner. He was just a smaller figure, but worked with Mao Zedong all the way. In fact, even during the Cultural Revolution, he never opposed Mao Zedong. Just that Mao Zedong didn't trust him anymore because he was not close enough to his ideas. He put him aside, but did not kill him. And Deng Xiaoping never denied Mao Zedong. He was kept quiet and survived the Cultural Revolution because Deng Xiaoping actually believed in the same thing that Mao Zedong did. And he, in a way, inherited what Mao Zedong had succeeded, but wiser than Mao Zedong because he recognized that you've got your revolution, you can't go on having more revolutions. You more and more revolutions you have, you destroy the revolution. So he cut the word revolution out, replaced it by the word reform to consolidate what you had achieved in 1949, not in the Cultural Revolution, but in 1949. What you achieved then, to consolidate that, to make sure that that CCP revolution will continue to be successful, to build something that will go on, continuity with the whole of Chinese history. That's what he offered. When it comes to Xi Jinping, how can he compare with these two men? Nothing to compare. He was basically a technocrat. I mean, his father was a revolutionary, but he was a princeling. He was sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. He worked as a peasant for 10 years of his life. He came out of it, he went to university, and he started as an official in a small town, and then became a bigger official in Xiamen, in the big city, and then Fujian, and then Zhejiang. All those years, he was no more than a technocrat, obeying orders from the center, doing whatever he thought a good technocrat, a good government official should be doing. And he did that. When people are asked, what did Xi Jinping achieved when he was an official in Hebei, in Xiamen, in Fujian, in Zhejiang, nobody can point to anything that he did that was remarkable. So the fact that he became Secretary General of the party was not his ambition. He didn't plan to be that.
Right.
When his name was proposed, lots of people had never heard of him. And why was he chosen? He was chosen because he had no faction. He was merely a princeling, so he had a kind of revolutionary background. Through his father. He had done nothing wrong because he did very little. Nothing against him. And he was never showed he was ambitious. Very quiet, no faction. Whereas the big challenger to Jiang Zemin, who was very powerful at the time, and Hu Jintao, was Bo Xilai, who was also a princeling, but very capable, did something in Chongqing, and extremely ambitious, and showed his ambition to do something to save the Communist Party. And Jiang Zemin didn't trust him, because he said this man could destroy his faction. So again, the factionism within the party. You see, it comes back to the question of succession.
Right.
How do this? Because nobody was named. Deng Xiaoping only named after Hu Jintao. No more after that. They had to determine who should succeed Hu Jintao. Without Deng Xiaoping's nomination, they had to make a decision. So Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao had different factions, all trying to get their men into place. Hu Jintao supported Li Keqiang, who was in the youth faction. Jiang Zemin had his own candidate, who were unacceptable. And there was Bo Xilai ambitiously trying to establish himself as the rightful heir to take over. Then Jiang Zemin actually played the decisive role in saying, I can't have Bo Xilai. He's too dangerous and he's corrupt anyway. And his group of friends are too also corrupt. Jiang Zemin himself was pretty corrupt. But he decided this quiet chap in Zhejiang, who had done nothing much and done nothing wrong and showed no ambition and had no faction, was safer. So he picked on Xi Jinping took his name up. Nobody objected because nobody could find anything wrong that he did because he didn't do much. And that's how he became leader. But he was not a stupid man. He had been observing all the time that the Communist Party was so corrupt. The People's Liberation Army itself was so corrupt that the Communist Party wouldn't have much of a chance to survive if he didn't sort that one out. So when he came in, his only program was to be anti-corruption. Most people think that, or some people think that, he used that to get rid of his enemies. I don't think that is true. Yeah. The truth is that he used that as the only way to establish himself as a credible leader to succeed and for the people to like him. And he became a very popular leader.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm surprised by the number of things I've read to say that he was the most popular leader since Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong was not popular in the way that he was popular. Mao Zedong was feared, but Xi Jinping was loved as a man who tried to get rid of all those corrupt officials and was so pervasive in the whole system that the fact that he got rid of the most obvious ones made him into a great hero. And so he became very popular. That popularity gave him more authority. And he used that authority, and because he didn't have a faction, he couldn't trust anybody in the top leadership. He became a micromanager.
Right.
He set up all sorts of committees, activist groups to deal with this issue, that issue, and every group was chaired by him. So he was chairman of all these groups, micromanaging everything. He did that for a few years, and because there was nobody else anyway, all the others were got rid of because of their corruption, he found himself doing too much. He didn't have any background in economics or any practical experience in making money for the country. China was benefiting from the globalization that had been going on. It was a WTO membership and so on. So when he started to do that, when the situation changed after Trump came in and after COVID, things began to go wrong, and he didn't know how to control it. So what I think he has done is to give up his micromanaging and set jobs for some of his comrades and doing less, but having the final say, but doing less and having other people do it. For example, I think it's quite significant. He's done a lot of the economic things are now passed on to Li Qiang. And Li Qiang actually speaks with great authority and more authority, but backed by Xi Jinping, but not Xi Jinping coming out himself, except saying broadly happy things, which nobody can disagree with. So how can you compare him with Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping? What has he done in his lifetime to put him in the same category? All I can say about him is that he believes in what Deng Xiaoping did. He is a follower of Deng Xiaoping. He believes in reform as a consolidation of the revolution. He also believes in continuity, the way Deng Xiaoping did. Continuity, including Maoist period, into the Kuomintang period, into the Qing dynasty, into the whole of Chinese history as the guarantor of Chinese identity. That this great People's Republic of China will always be Chinese, modernized in every other way, but still recognizably Chinese, depends on your sense of continuity with the whole of the Chinese past. That, I think, is what it's about. At least that's my understanding.
Professor, in 1978, the GDP per capita of China would have been a lot less than $1,000, a lot less than $1,000. Today, it's around $13,000. The rise or significant rise of income per capita in China would have been on the back of this underwriting of the international order by a hegemonic force called the United States, which I think was, according to some, a hegemony of magnanimity. But it is seemingly becoming less magnanimous, that hegemony. How do you foresee China moving forward, coexisting with not only that pre-existing superpower that seemingly becomes hegemonically less magnanimous, on top of these revisionist forces that are coming from countries that would have been really tiny, but have become much larger today?
I frankly don't have an answer to that very big question, but I would point to the decade of the 1990s as a key turning point to everything that happened to the last 20 years. In the 1990s, two things happened. One was the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the United States became the sole superpower. The second was America was trying to identify, do they have any more enemies out there? They've defeated the Soviet Union. And in the calculations of the strategists in America, they came to the conclusion that there were none except possibly, potentially, China. The only possible threat to Americans' number one sole superpower position was China. And because it was unitary, it was then under Deng Xiaoping was still alive, and Jiang Zemin, they were doing very well, picking up, learning from the West. They were sending their best students, studying in the United States, coming back to improve their economy, and they were making a difference. And the American strategists, I think, were not wrong. If anybody could ever threaten the sole superpower, it would have been China. Because looking at India, Middle East, or any other part of the world, none of them could provide that kind of challenge. So one group already identified China as a potential threat. The other group, more ideological group, I think, were not so realistic about it, thought that the Chinese economy was actually modeling itself. The kind of capitalism that Deng Xiaoping was introducing to China was actually borrowing lots of ideas from the West, creating the kind of industries, creating the manufacturing infrastructure to compete in the outside, in the capitalist world. What if they created, in the end, a middle class that, if they're successful, would demand the kind of political liberalization that would make it more like us, United States. And there were people who felt we shouldn't treat the Chinese as a threat. We should treat the Chinese as a challenge to enable the Chinese to be economically successful to the point that they actually want to copy us and recognize us as the leader of the world. I'm oversimplifying, but they were debating very much at that point. It was at that point that President Clinton had to make a decision, and the decision was whether or not to let China join the WTO. And I think you remember the details about
2001,
that. Yeah. And Clinton was not willing. He was very hesitant. Some of his advisors were saying, they are communists in the end. How can you trust them to observe the rules of GATT and WTO? They would take advantage and so on. But others felt that if they succeeded in taking advantage and becoming successful as a capitalist economy, modeling themselves on us, they could change. So that made the final turn, and Clinton reluctantly, I think, agreed to let Zhu Rongji, in fact, take the WTO rules. And Zhu Rongji did that to use the WTO rules to change the whole of the whole infrastructure of Chinese factory and manufacturing and so on, to follow the WTO rules, to take advantage of the globalization that the rules allowed. And he was successful. To everyone's surprise, how successful he was. That was those 10 years from Clinton letting them in to 2008, when the financial crisis undermined the American economy. Those 10 years were the best years of the Chinese economy by Johnny W.T. No, we know that now for certain. But for the Chinese, it was just good luck because there was globalization at its freest. So all the capitalists in America moved their factories to China as they should, according to capitalist principles. You go to where the labor is the cheapest and the quality is maintained, you make more money. And we do know the capitalists who invested in China became the richest people in America. The Chinese didn't make much money out of it, but they gained enough to relieve lots of people from poverty, but they didn't make that much money. Their percentage of the profits were very low compared to what the capitalists were gaining. So the paradox is the American capitalists became richer, but the American middle class lost out. They lost their jobs because the factories all moved out, all the engineering and so on. And the working class also lost their jobs. The working class who were aspiring to be a virtual middle class in America began to lose their jobs or lost their jobs. So next thing they knew, they started to blame China for what happened to them. Whereas in fact, it was the rules of capitalist development, globalized, that made that difference. And the paradox is that the American capitalists are richer than ever, even today. With all these uncertainties that we are facing today, the American capitalists are actually getting richer. And Trump's friends and so on are actually getting richer, while the rest of the American population still has to, I think, bear the burden of paying those tariffs, because that will affect them. Their consumer prices are rising because if they don't get it direct from China with a lot of tariffs added, they're going to pay more, and because they can't make it themselves anymore. It take a long time for the manufacturers to actually turn up in America to recover. So the poor and the middle class are actually paying for all this, where the rich are getting richer. So this is going to undermine, to my mind anyway, to undermine the stability of the American system itself.
I want to test a hypothesis with you. I've been increasingly observing that China and the West are likely to be indispensable inevitabilities for Southeast Asia. In the context of our looking at China increasingly more for technological capital allocation and the West for economic capital allocation. Southeast Asia is filled with developing economies who earn a lot less than $13,000. They can't afford iPhones. They can only afford Oppos, the phones from China, which are actually taking better pictures than iPhones, admittedly. But the West is blessed with tremendous amount of liquidity. And it's just within our vested interest in Southeast Asia for most of the developing economies, in order to move up the value chain and the global geopolitical order, for them to look at China for technological allocation and the West for economic allocation. Is that hypothesis worthy of admitting?
See, I can't see Southeast Asia as a whole taking any single model, either one of those, because it doesn't fit. And the conditions of China are completely different from those of any one country in Southeast Asia, and certainly not for the region. And similarly, the United States. The United States has a very distinctive history of its own. And frankly, for the first 60, 70 years after the Second World War, the liberal ideals of America were dominant, and most people admired it very much and thought that was the model for the future for all countries, that we will all enjoy the freedom, the kind of guarantee of stability and peace, and which the ideals of trying to solve every problem through rule-based order, all these ideals were highly respected. And most people trusted that the United States was out to ensure that that would be the ultimate end for the world, and that was how the world will always be at peace. If we can all move towards that. The only people who were standing in the way of that was the Soviet Union and the Cold War. Right. So it was over simple, but so when they won the Cold War, you can understand why the Americans thought, this is it. I mean, that's why Fukuyama can talk about the end of history. I mean, they really thought that they won. I mean, just not won a battle, they won the whole war. And the world has now reached a point when everybody knows this is the way to go. But it turned out not to be so. And that, I think, surprised my generation anyway, because we had different hopes and ideals from the 1945 onwards to believe that our new nations in a world of equal sovereign independent states was the future. And to try and set aside all signs of inequality as only temporary will move towards that ideal ultimately. Well, it has not worked out like that. And when, to that extent, those people who believed in those ideals were not prepared for what happened. So in a way, when you look at the Democrats in the United States, especially under Biden, and so they were actually using the slogans of the past. It didn't actually carry that same credibility or even confidence that it used to have. Mixed up with it was quite a lot of fear. The fear of losing their hegemony, the fear of failing, and a sense of desperation that they're going to do something to check China, check other people who are creating trouble, not following their rules and so on. But it became very negative. Instead of something positive offered to the world, it became something negative. If you don't do this, you mustn't do that, and so on. And ultimately, nothing worked. Everything that they tried to do after they won the Cold War failed. Intervention in the Mediterranean states, in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan and all the others, every single one of them ended up with no real achievements, no step forward to a better world, but every time losing credibility and making the world even less certain, including the United States itself. And when the United States lost its own confidence and became fearful of the world that they now could not control and which they had created and did not understand why they couldn't control it, that has now added to the whole world's uncertainty, because a given system has been shown to be deficient and not able to provide the kind of things that they promised us. So those people who had believed them, who actually had faith in them, are now very disillusioned. And that itself is a bad sign, because when people lose their sense of idealism or their hopes and no longer expect the world to be better, then the world will get worse, because you need people to still want the world to be better to have a chance at all. Mind you, as an optimist, I believe that these people still exist and they will appear. But we're now going to a stage when we don't know who these people are, how they're going to achieve that breakthrough to come out of this uncertainty and create a new way of looking at the world, or new kind of order which we can live with. We're not sure about that, but we are going to a very testing stage. No. And I think the generation, not mine, but the generation below me and below that group of people with new technology, new ways of looking at the world, new ways of reaching out, they have to find some way of restructuring a world order which could have a better chance.
王庚武教授以95岁高龄，在这么长时间的访谈中，神采奕奕，侃侃而谈，思路之清晰，见解之深刻，真的让人佩服。通篇看下来，你会发现他对每个话题都不做非黑即白的简单评判，比如古代中国和古代印度的对比，比如表音文字和表意文字的对比，比如中国当代西化路径1和西化路径2的对比，还比如民主与专制在选贤任能方面的对比，等等等等。 他都像他在采访中说的那样，持中立的态度去分析，不偏袒任何一方。王庚武是公认的海外华人研究奠基人之一，他所提出的海外华人这个概念被全球学界普遍采用。他既研究中国古代史，也关注中国现代化议题，从政治、外交、文化等多个维度分析近现代中国如何在民族国家构建、全球化浪潮冲击下摸索自身发展的现代路径，对理解中国现当代历史演进有重要参考价值。王庚武凭借扎实的学术功底、宏阔的研究视野与深刻的历史洞察力，在史学界备受赞誉。新加坡前总统纳丹赞誉他是新加坡国宝级学者。他与余英时、徐作云等并称为3大海外华人史学大师，在全球华人史学群体中占据核心的领军位置。